As we get into the 1600s, Spain controlled Central and South America, leaving much of North America unsettled. That will change in the first 10 years of the 17th century. 3 European countries will settle 3 small colonies within 3 years of one another, kicking off a rapid settlement of North America. Spain will continue its conquest, founding Santa Fe in 1610, but Britain enters the fray in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown, and the French first colonized North America at Quebec in 1608. Though we'll discuss French colonization later, our focus of this video will be Britain, and specifically the Chesapeake colonies and Jamestown. There's some important context to the attempts of British colonization. Britain and Spain, who were allies for years before colonization, became enemies following the Protestant Reformation. King Henry VII broke with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s and began a conflict that will pit English Catholics with English Protestants. By the time Queen Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, England was predominantly Protestant and created a strong rivalry between Spain, who was predominantly Catholic, and Britain, who was predominantly Protestant. The conflict between the two was heightened when Elizabeth encouraged English pirates to attack Spanish merchant ships on their way back from the New World in hopes of confiscating large quantities of American gold. The conflict between Spain and Britain came to a head in 1588 when Spain's massive armada of over 130 ships began an invasion of England, only to be defeated by a smaller and swifter British Navy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada opened the door for more exploration and colonization of the Americas by other European countries, since Spain had less resources to defend its holdings in North America. This defeat not only opened the door for large-scale British colonization of North America, but it put Britain on track to the naval dominance that will define the next century. Here's your author. A wondrous flowering of the English national spirit boomed in the wake of the Spanish Armada's defeat. The English were seized with restlessness, with thirst for adventure, and with curiosity about the unknown. When England and Spain finally signed a treaty of peace in 1607, the English people were poised to plunge headlong in the planting of their own colonial empire in the New World. The Protestant Reformation and the defeat of the Spanish Armada are important contexts to the causes of British colonization of the New World. But now, let's talk about the causes of British colonization of the New World. First, England experienced a dramatic population growth during the latter half of the 1500s. Its population grew from about 3 million people in 1550 to about 4 million by 1600. That rapid growth of population put significant pressure on people to find usable land when they were old enough to move away from their parents. Second, the lack of land caused many of these young farmers to renting land from larger landlords or forcing them off the land altogether. This led to a massive expansion of the poor by the end of the century. Third was the laws of primogeniture. These laws exacerbated the problem of the land list and population growth. The laws said that only the eldest son inherits their parents' fortune, leading to younger siblings to find fortune elsewhere or work for their siblings. Fourth, there was a small population of Puritans and Catholics that will risk moving to the New World to escape the religious persecution in Britain in order to live with the freedom to express their religion. We'll talk more about this later. And last, the expansion of joint stock companies, which expanded the pool of money to invest in overseas colonies, cannot be understated. Here's your author. Population growth provided the workers, unemployment as well as thirst for adventure, for markets, and religious freedom provided the motives. Joint stock companies provided the financial means. The stage was now set for the historic efforts to establish the British beachhead in the still uncharted North American wilderness. Britain's first attempt of colonization actually happened before the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and it was what was going to be called the Lost Colony of Roanoke. The colonists of Roanoke are going to mysteriously disappear, possibly join another Native American tribe, or were attacked, or maybe the Spanish might have eliminated the colony before the British can set their roots. In 1607, a joint stock company received a charter from King James I to establish a colony in Virginia. This charter of Jamestown, named after King James, gave all of the settlers the same rights as Englishmen in order to keep them loyal to Britain. The primary purpose of this colony was economic, with the objective to find gold and find a passage through America and establish a trade route to the West Indies, still a coveted goal for the Europeans. The initial Jamestown settlement was moved up the river after attacks by local Indians, but the problems of their new location popped up immediately. Many of the settlers died in early Jamestown, one from malaria because of the massive amount of mosquitoes, and also from starvation because many of the settlers were looking for gold instead of looking for provisions to survive. In fact, nearly half of the original settlers died in the first year between 1609 and 1610. Nearly 90% of the 500 Jamestown inhabitants died of disease and starvation. Settlers and historians refer to this era as the Starving Time. Here's your author, David Kennedy. Still, the colonists died in droves, and living skeletons were driven to desperate act. They were reduced to eating dogs, cats, rats, and mice, and even digging up corpses for food. One hungry man killed, salted, and ate his wife. For his misbehavior, he was executed. For the 400 settlers who managed to make it to Virginia by 1609, only 60 survived the Starving Time winter of 1609 to 1610. The infant colony was saved from total failure by a man by the name of John Smith, when he created stability by implementing a policy that would incentivize growing food first. Smith's policy was simple: he who shall not work shall not eat. This helped limit the number of people who spent all their time searching for gold and instead grow crops and search for food. However, as John Smith stabilized the colony, a new problem came to the forefront: how to interact with the Native Americans who lived in the area. The Native American tribe in that region were a loose confederation of tribes led by a chief named Powhatan, and the name of the tribal groups was the Powhatan Confederacy. The tension between the Powhatans and Jamestown colonists were very high, especially during the Starving Time, since the starving colonists would raid the nearby tribes to gather food. And a few years earlier, John Smith was captured by Powhatan and was going to be executed, but Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, stopped the execution. Most historians believe that this was a mock execution to show the power of Powhatan, but nonetheless, Pocahontas hereafter became the intermediary between the two groups. However, in 1610, a new governor was sent to the colonies to restore order and profitability. That governor was Lord De La Warr. De La Warr developed a militaristic style regime on the young colony. The new authorities meted out harsh discipline. One Jamestown settler who publicly criticized the governor was sentenced to be disarmed and have his arms broken and his tongue bored through with an awl, and shall pass through a guard of 40 men, and shall be butted with muskets by every one of them, and the head of the troop kicked down and footed at the fort. De La Warr also planned aggressive military action against the Powhatan Confederacy. This would result in the First and Second Powhatan Wars. In 1610, De La Warr declared war on Powhatan. Using tactics that he learned from brutal conflicts in Europe, De La Warr ordered the Virginians to raid Indian villages, burn houses, confiscate provisions, and torch cornfields. In 1614, the first peace agreement was agreed to, and it was sealed with the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. More on John Rolfe later. The peace was just temporary. In 1622, the Indians attacked the colonists, killing 347 colonists, in which the response from the colonies was a perpetual war against the Powhatan. However, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War kicked off in 1644 when the Powhatan made one final attempt to dislodge the Virginians. After that failed, the Peace Treaty of 1649 effectively banned the Powhatan people from the area, since it was clear that there was no way for the two to peacefully coexist. By 1685, most Europeans believed that the Powhatan were completely extinct. Here's David Kennedy. It has been the Powhatan's calamitous misfortune to fall victim to the 3 Ds: disease, disorganization, and disposability. Like native peoples throughout the New World, they were extremely susceptible to European-born epidemics of smallpox and measles raced mercilessly through their village. The Powhatans also, despite their apparent cohesiveness of the Powhatan Confederacy, lacked the unity with which to make effective opposition to the comparatively well-organized and military disciplined white. Finally, unlike the Indians whom the Spanish had encountered in the South, who could be put to work in the mines and had gold and silver to trade, the Powhatans served no economic function for the Virginian colonist. They provided no reliable source of labor, growing their own food crops, had no valuable commodities to offer in commerce. The natives, as far as the Virginians were concerned, could be disposed without harm to the colonial economy. Indeed, the Indian presence frustrated the colonists' desire for a local commodity the Europeans desperately wanted: land. Though the story of the early interactions of the Atlantic seaboard between the Native Americans and the Europeans seemed to be one-sided due to technology deficit and disease, the Indians had a rough time keeping culture together, so they developed cultures that were a mix of both European and theirs. However, in some areas in North America, Indian dominance of the area led the Europeans to reform their own cultures. For instance, the Algonquin of the Great Lakes became a regional superpower, and any French or British traders had to conform to the Indian ways and take an Indian wife to coexist and trade with the Indians in that region. Let's take a look at Virginia's economy as it develops into a stable colony. For this, we need to return to the aforementioned John Rolfe. John Rolfe learned how to raise tobacco in order to eliminate a bitter taste that most tobacco included at the time. This new type of tobacco caused European demand for American tobacco to explode. This new demand increased the price of tobacco, leading to Virginians to plant tobacco everywhere, so much so that they had to import food. Since tobacco was so labor and land intensive, they expanded further and further west to gain new soil for planting. To attempt to address the issue of labor, attempts to import African slaves began toward the end of the first 20 years of the colony. In 1619, a Dutch warship appeared and sold 20 Africans for labor in Virginia. This event will plant the seed for American slavery, but not right away. It was still very expensive to own a slave. Thus, slavery was very rare in the first half of the 1600s. Only 300 African slaves existed in the colonies in 1650. However, by the end of the 1600s, African slaves would make up 14% of the colony's population. We'll discuss more about the tobacco economy and the rise of slavery later in this video. Representative self-government was also born in primitive Virginia in the same cradle with slavery and in the same year, 1619. The Virginia Company authorized the settlers to summon an assembly known as the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses became the first system of governance in the British colonies. A momentous precedent was thus feebly established, for this assemblage was the first of many miniature parliaments that flourished throughout America. Moving away from Virginia, let's take a look at the other Chesapeake colony that develops in the 1600s, Maryland. Founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore, which became a legal refuge for Catholics who were being persecuted in England. Maryland's economy and development looked very similar to Virginia. Heavily tobacco and eventually large slave plantations would develop, and Maryland would be an exporter of tobacco. But what does make Maryland unique is the law that passed in 1649, the Act of Toleration. The Act of Toleration was created to protect Catholic settlers due to agitation from other Protestant settlers. The act required toleration for all Christians in the colonies. However, it did prescribe the death penalty for those who didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus. Now let's continue to move down the coastline to discuss the founding of the colonies in both the West Indies and the Southern colonies. When discussing the Southern colonies and the West Indies, we usually mean the Carolinas, Georgia, and Barbados. Let's first take a look at Barbados. This tiny island in the Caribbean will have significant impacts on the development of the slave-holding colonies of Britain. Sugar was still desired by people around the world, and Barbados was a perfect climate for sugarcane. This process of refining sugar was an expensive and labor-intensive process. Wealthy investors established plantations in Barbados and imported African slaves. In fact, between 1640 and 1690, 250,000 slaves were transported to the island. However, the horrific conditions were widely known by the African slaves who were in transport to Barbados. One English settler said this: "The Africans are so loath to leave their own country. They have often leaped out of the canoes, boat, and ship into the sea and kept underwater until they were drowned to avoid being taken up and saved by our boats, which pursued them, they having a more dreadful apprehension of Barbados than we can have of hell." Quickly, the number of slaves outnumbered the white planters, and it was determined that the slaves needed to be controlled for the protection of the planters. In 1661, the Barbados Slave Codes were passed, which denied the fundamental rights of African slaves and gave masters complete control over their slaves, and the masters can inflict vicious punishments in order to keep control. Here's an excerpt from the Barbados Slave Codes. "If any black slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to a Christian by striking or the like, such slave shall have his or her first offense be severely whipped by a constable. For his second offense of that nature he shall be severely whipped and his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron. And being brutish slaves, they deserve not, for the baseness of their condition, to be tried by the legal trial of 12 men and their peers, as subjects of England are. And it is further enacted and ordained that if any black slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or member, which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be liable to any fine therefore." So in essence, these slave codes give full right for the master to punish the slaves in any way without any recognition of the rights of the slave. Some of the smaller farmers from Barbados began moving to the Carolinas in 1670 and bringing with them not only the African slaves, but the Barbados Slave Codes, which inspired all of the other slave laws throughout the colony. In addition, the settlers of the Carolinas, especially North Carolina, had conflict with Native American tribes, much like all of the other colonies. One conflict in particular, the Tuscarora War, pushed Native Americans out of the Carolinas, a process that was very similar to the counterparts in the Chesapeake. And lastly, just a quick mention about Georgia. Founded in 1733 as a buffer between the very valuable Carolinas, which are also going to be known to develop cash crops and the plantation system, and Spanish Florida. Georgia also became a haven for those who were imprisoned for debt in England. All of these colonies, both in the Chesapeake, with Virginia and Maryland, and the southern colonies with North and South Carolina, Georgia, and Barbados were called the plantation colonies for their prevalent single crop plantations. Now that we're finished discussing the early foundation of the Chesapeake and southern colonies, I want to go back and focus on the Chesapeake in particular because it develops a unique identity during the rest of the 17th century. As mentioned before, the Chesapeake colonies had issues with diseases. That problem never goes away. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhoid assured that half of the population born in Virginia or Maryland were dead by 20. Additionally, the colony grew very slowly because most immigrants to the Chesapeake were young men who died quickly, and those survivors had to compete for the few women to marry in that region. The ratio of men to women was 6-1, which meant that women didn't stay single very long when they came of age or when they arrived in the colony. Here's David Kennedy again. Families were both few and fragile in this ferocious environment. Most men could not find mates. Most marriages were destroyed by the death of a partner within 7 years. Scarcely any children reached adulthood under the care of two parents, and almost no one knew a grandparent. Weak family ties were reflected in the many pregnancies among unmarried young girls. In one Maryland county, more than a third of all brides were already pregnant when they were wed. Moments ago, we discussed the cultivation of tobacco and that it increased the price of tobacco and caused many to plant more tobacco, especially when a European demand for the American tobacco was large, leading to more space being used for tobacco production. However, tobacco becomes overproduced in the 17th century to the point that where the increase in supply leads to lower tobacco prices, causing more planters to plant more tobacco just to maintain their income. To produce this much tobacco, the planters experienced a massive labor problem in the first half of the 1600s. The natural growth of the white English population was too slow to have enough workers. Native Americans couldn't be used because they died so quickly of disease after European contact. And in the first half of the 17th century, African slavery was too expensive and risky because of the high mortality rates. However, there was a solution. Let's go back to England. There was a surplus of young men in England looking for jobs, and many decided to go to America as indentured servants. So what is an indentured servant? Indentured servants are workers that sign a contract to work for a master in America for about 4 to 7 years in return for that master to pay for their trip from England to the Americas. After the 4 to 7 year contract, which many didn't survive long enough to fulfill, the surviving indentured servant usually received things like farm supplies, a barrel of corn to survive, a suit of clothes, and a small parcel of land. It's also important to know that the land that the indentured servants were receiving pushed up against Indian land and caused many conflicts, but more on that later. Another very important piece to the early Chesapeake culture was the establishment of the headright system in 1618. The headright system gave plantation owners the option to buy 50 acres of land for every indentured servant that they brought over to the colonies. The use of the headright system allowed some planters to acquire vast holdings and developed an elite class of landowners that will dominate the House of Burgesses, the aforementioned lawmaking body. This system brought over 100,000 indentured servants to the Chesapeake by 1700. These indentured servants represented 3/4 of all immigrants to Virginia and Maryland by the end of the century. Of course, this system became abusive. Some masters would arbitrarily extend the contract or hire out the servants. A very important event of the 17th century was Bacon's Rebellion. First, we need to understand the long-term causes. There was little land to give the indentured servants, so they were given land further west and sometimes in Indian Territory, which led to conflicts with Native Americans. Also, there were few women to marry in the Chesapeake due to the gender imbalance. And lastly, the indentured servants who were without land couldn't vote and participate in governmental decisions. These issues would create an environment of discontent among the lower class and indentured servants, waiting for a single trigger to start the revolt. That brings us to 1676. In 1676, Native American tribes began attacking frontier settlements that were populated with mostly former indentured servants living near Indian land. The settlers appealed back east to Jamestown for help from their governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley. However, Berkeley declined to help, and raged by the response, Nathaniel Bacon, ironically a wealthy farmer, organized 1,000 former indentured servants and became the leader of Bacon's rebellion. Bacon's men took the matter into their own hands and attacked local Indian tribes, regardless of whether they were the tribes responsible for attacking the frontier. After that, Bacon's men turned their anger on Jamestown to attack and burn Jamestown to the ground. His men, mostly former indentured servants and poor farmers, plundered and rampaged Jamestown. But before the end of the revolt, Bacon died of disease, which gave Berkeley the opening to put down the revolt and execute 20 men. This rebellion shows that there was a growing discontent between Western poor farmers and the Eastern wealthy, powerful elites. However, the most important effect of Bacon's rebellion was that plantation owners began moving away from indentured servants and decided to invest more into African slavery, expanding the scope of the American slavery story. Now that we know by the end of the 17th century there seems to be a preference for more African slavery by the plantation owners of the Chesapeake, now is a good time to switch over to begin focusing on the expansion of slavery. And we're going to focus on the Chesapeake again in the discussion for the expansion of American slavery. Before we jump into the expansion of American slavery, it's really important that we recognize that slavery has happened all over the world in almost all of recorded history. The ancient Greeks and Romans, medieval Korea, the Pacific Northwest Indians practiced slavery, Aztecs practiced slavery, Vikings practiced slavery, pre-Norman England, many ethnic groups in Africa, and the early Arabs, and of course, the American plantation slavery that develops in the United States. Now, it's also very important that the American plantation slavery is different because, unlike many of these other examples, the American plantation slavery is different because it is chattel slavery, which means that the slaves are property. The slaves are property of the owner, and that is not consistent throughout the rest of the slave-owning world. We're going to start with kind of going back over some of the causes of American slavery and why did the slavery develop in specific areas, especially in the Chesapeake. And number one is going to be environmental. The warm climate of the Chesapeake was perfect for labor-intensive crops like tobacco, eventually like cotton. But these labor-intensive cash crops grow well in this warm climate in which they have a large growing season. And also in the South, there's a significant abundance of land in which they can continue to move west to get more land to plant the crops. These cash crops are going to be perfect for the plantation systems that have been coming over from Europe and of course from Barbados. That is going to lead us to more African slavery. We also discussed that there is an economic cause to the cause of the expansion of slavery. First, we have already spoken about that Europe had a heavy demand for tobacco. And of course, this heavy demand increased the price of tobacco, and that leads planters to wanting to plant more tobacco, and therefore more tobacco, they needed more labor, and we see a slight expansion of African slavery. But remember, in the early part of the 1700s, that is not as significant because the price of the slaves were very high. And as we just spoke about, the effects of Bacon's Rebellion, there is now a preference of plantation owners to want to switch to African slaves. They don't want the indentured servants anymore because the indentured servants are causing problems within the colonies. They have to give the indentured servants land in the West, which leads them to conflict with Native Americans. But the supply of indentured servants are beginning to fall as well. In England, wages are beginning to increase. Fewer people are wanting to become indentured servants. So with those two things combined, again, we start seeing the expansion of African slavery in the Americas. Another very important thing that is going to expand slavery in Americas is the development of the triangle trade system. The Americas are going to be well known to be able to create the raw products. The raw products and materials are going to be sent to Europe, and Europe is going to refine those and to send this manufactured goods to Africa, of course, to be used to buy more slaves, and those slaves are going to be sent to the Americas and the Caribbean. And the passage is going to be called the Middle Passage. And many of you guys have heard the Middle Passage before, that link between Africa and the Americas. There's going to be a 20% death rate in this Middle Passage. So this established trade system is also going to expand the labor that is required in order to get the raw materials to Europe. An additional economic event that is going to expand slavery is the loss of the Dutch slave trade monopoly. The Dutch had a monopoly on the slave trade, which kept prices high. And after 1882, just a few years after the Bacon's Rebellion, after 1882, now more countries get involved in the slave trade. And as more countries get involved in the slave trade, the price of slaves begin to fall. This is the perfect time because the owners no longer want indentured servants. The price of indentured servants are falling. The demand for products from America is increasing. And with the decrease in the price of slaves, we now start seeing more and more slaves being purchased, especially in the Chesapeake and the southern colonies. Very similar to Barbados, the plantation owners wanted to control the slaves. Particularly, they wanted to make sure that there were no free slaves in the area that would inspire revolt. In 1662, Virginia begins passing slave codes. This is not just coincidental. Remember the Barbados slave codes. Virginia then passes more slave codes that are going to control the lives of the slaves. So in 1662, the slave codes are going to be passed. There's going to be a clear distinction between servants and slaves, and Africans and their children are going to become property of their masters. Remember, that's what's making American slavery different, because they are chattel, they are property. Some colonies are even going to go as far as outlawing reading and writing to help stem the tide of possible rebellion. And by 1750, 50% of all the Virginian population were African slaves. These slave codes and slave owners are also going to do something to make the state of slavery perpetual for Africans, especially in the South. And the next most significant thing is the status of the slave is going to be passed through the mother, which is interesting because most genetics and most tracing of your family tree goes through the father, but they are going to make the status of the slave through the mother. Now, we're not going to talk about in this video why, but I want you to think why. Why does the status of slave pass through the mother and not the father? I want to give the final word of this video to your author. He's going to make a claim about what will eventually be the relationship between slavery and race. Here's David Kennedy. Slavery might have begun in America for economic reasons, but by the end of the 17th century, it was clear that racial discrimination also powerfully molded the American slave system. And just as race shaped slavery, so did slavery shape the entire spectrum of race relations, as both law and custom increasingly circumscribed the lives of enslaved and free blacks alike, in the North as well as in the South. From this time forward, the boundary between freedom and unfreedom in America ran along the color line. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our video. We have a lot to discuss. Make sure you have all your notes down. I'll talk to you soon.